Stephen Totilo's The Daddening of Video Games was published on the Kotaku website in February 2010. He talks about how we have shifted in the video game landscape from playing sons to playing fathers. He talks about 3 recent games that he's experienced and how the role of fatherhood is so prominent in them. The games he talks about are Heavy Rain, Silent Hill, and BioShock 2. What Stephen doesn't know is that 2010 was about to kick off a long decade of the daddening of video games becoming more and more prominent. And upon reviewing his writing that's now 14 years old, I think it's really humorous that I've never actually played these games, but I would have my own triumvirate of video games that talk about the daddening of the landscape. When we zoom out and we talk about macro trends in video game narratives, one of the things that continues to jump out at me that I really just want to talk about is this idea of the daddening and how the 2010s to me was the decade of the dad. There's going to be a lot to unpack here, and I want to cover large swaths of land as we go on this quest and venture together, and there are 4 main questions that I want you to keep in the back of your head that I'm going to try to answer as we move through the teenage years of the 21st century. Question 1 is, why are there so many dads? Or, in our vernacular for this video, why daddy? Question 2 is it a problem that there are so many dads? Or, daddy bad? Question number 3 is, where are all the moms? Or, mommy? And question 4, what's going to happen next? Or, post-daddy? This was all spurred by getting into a conversation about masculinity in media with a colleague a few months ago. I've wanted to talk about this for a long time. I've had a draft for this video going all the way back to 2019, but it's got so complicated that I just decided, you know what, fine, I'm going to try it. I'm going to figure it out. We're going to go. If you like talking about feminism in video games or single-player narratives or the critical analysis of trends in both game dev and gamers, you're in luck. That's what we're talking about. So join me as we go back in time to 2010 and embark on this quest into the decade of the video game dad. The easiest place to start with these 4 questions is with why daddy. We start with the obvious. Game devs are getting older and having kids. The industry itself really isn't that old in comparison to other creative fields and industries, so we've reached a kind of maturation point. This is best exemplified in 2 creative visionaries, one being Neil Druckmann of The Last of Us and the second being Cory Barlog of God of War. Both got their starts at Naughty Dog and Santa Monica Studios respectively in the 2000s, before this decade of the dad began, both working on games that didn't have fatherhood being such a strong central narrative force in the story. When they got a turn to helm a game, it coincided with their own evolution as creatives, now with kids. Druckmann wrote in a 2013 The Last of Us AMA that, "My daughter was a huge inspiration for my writing in the game." Barlog wrote in 2016 that writing Kratos' character was aided by the birth of my own son. But Kratos demonstrates the evolution of game protagonists too. Kratos evolves from using the death of his daughter as a source of characterization to now his son being on screen beside him, constantly engaged with, evolving. We're going to come back to Kratos and God of War again. Anyways, alongside aging game developers at major studios is that gamers themselves are getting older. In a 2024 Electronic Software Association fact sheet on US gamers, we see a shift in demographics. And even though this is US specific, my hunch is that this is applicable to most countries. In 2004, the average age of a gamer was 29. In 2024, the average age of a gamer is 36. Gaming is not staying as a young person thing. We're not all still drunk on Mountain Dew, crushing Cool Ranch Doritos, and failing to study for grade 12 calculus. What I think is probably a more interesting signifier or signpost of the wildly different gaming demographic than 20 years ago is from this same ESA fact sheet, that in 1999, 9% of gamers were over the age of 50. Today, it's 29%. Nearly 1/3 of US gamers are over the age of 50. We have to caveat that this likely encapsulates now a lot of different kinds of games, like mobile gaming. But when combined with the average increasing, it's very clear that gamers are getting older alongside their makers. And with age often comes parenthood. So why not mothers then? Why still all the daddies? And gender demographics of gamers is incredibly finicky in my opinion. One of the recent data points that folks like to point out to is this Sony PS5 executive presentation that shows how 40% of PS5 account registration were female identifying. This has been extrapolated to say that 40% of PS5 owners are female, which I feel like doesn't dig into the fact that moms are making accounts for their kids. I know my mom surely did back in the day of the 360. I have no doubt that this trend is continuing. But then people turn to another popular dataset, which is Circana's Player Plus dataset, which is on surveying US households. There is this approximately 40-60 split between girls and boys owning and playing games. Is there a difference between genres? Definitely. Is my own YouTube channel, which I would call an enthusiast gaming channel thing, that same 40-60 split? Not even close. It's like 10-90. So how reliable is all this data about gender really? I bet it's like some triangulation, but we don't really have good market data. And I think that there is still this prevailing assumption that game boys are more of the majority than game girls. Does this explain the extreme imbalance of daddy versus mommy in video games though? We're gonna get back to that later on. Anyways, the third idea is that outside of the hard data, we're now looking at the evolution of the heroic male archetype. We've talked about Kratos briefly, and he's actually emblematic of this evolution from dead daughter to sidekick son. Stephen Totilo mentioned how we've gone from plain sons to fathers in his 2010 article, but this isn't entirely true. Like any generalization of video game stories, we have played as fathers in the past. Max Payne stands out as an example. It's just that daughters and sons were usually killed off in Chapter 1 or kidnapped or otherwise traumatized to create some sort of inciting drive in the player character to shoot bad guys. Totilo is definitely right that fatherhood has been and continues to be a pretense to violence. Somewhere around 2010, everyone suddenly realized that having kids, usually daughters, actually present in the story makes for a wildly more interesting game narrative. BioShock Infinite in 2013, Telltale's The Walking Dead in 2012, The Last of Us in 2013 are all examples. So too is Red Dead Redemption in 2010, putting John Marston's son as a key anchor in the final act. You can get more out of a story when fatherhood becomes more than just simple revenge, but something that needs to be actively engaged with by our gruff male heroes. We historically had dads not having to deal with being dads. We've grown out of that, likely because game stories overall have become more sophisticated, we've demanded more of them, and the industry has just sort of grown up a bit. The fourth idea is that being a dad is just really a narrative shorthand that front-loads everything and anything so efficiently onto a player. Oh, this is my hero dude, versus, oh, this is my hero dude and he's a dad. There's a universalism to fatherhood to parenthood that creates a whole web of relationships, questions, motivations, and just really a simple identifier. Just as fatherhood was used historically as a motivating factor, I've no doubt it has continued to be used as an emotional shortcut for game developers. But it also expands to more than just playing as fathers. And here I want to expand the scope of the decade of the dad, go on a little side quest, because there's been some academic literature. Actually, there's been a lot of academic literature. There's been a lot of online discussion, and there's some pretty popular videos that discuss fatherhood and us playing as fathers. Dads in Video Games by Nakey Jakey, and Moms in Video Games, but we'll get back to that. And the dadding of video games by Just Right are pretty prominent examples of this discussion. But I think if we look at fatherhood beyond just playing as fathers, you'll see it frickin' everywhere. I don't think there's a single first-party PlayStation 5 big movie game that doesn't have fatherhood oozing from its story. You could blindly throw a dart at the corkboard of new releases, and I bet you fatherhood will be a present idea. Jin Sakai, Peter Parker, Aloy all have prominent daddy issues that sculpt and mold significant portions of the game narrative. If you go one layer deep, some of my favorite games have daddy plastered everywhere, like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, and even the Mass Effect trilogy. Make no mistake how daddy the final scene with Captain Anderson really is. Basically, every Assassin's Creed game that has come out since the first one, and maybe even arguably the first one, has fatherhood as such a central idea. Radun Hagedun, Edward Kenway, Bayek, Cassandra, the stories of fathers are so imprinted on this franchise. Get me out of this.
Exactly like father.
If only.
The biggest RPG of the 2010s, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, has fatherhood on like 50 freaking different levels, between Geralt, the Bloody Baron, Vesemir, Crack on Crate, and I'm sure there's more. Even in indie games, daddy is ubiquitous. Hades, The Banner Saga, Life is Strange, Lisa, maybe even arguably in Papers, Please. Every Grand Theft Auto game, not that there's been that many, every Dishonored game, the biggest heroes of the past decade like Arthur Morgan and Nathan Drake. Anyways, I could go on. So scribble dad on your character design doc and you've just effortlessly loaded a whole lot of stuff into a character and their story. I think we've caught on to this trick now as gamers, but it only took us a solid 10 years in countless games. Woo! Still with me? Okay, because with the final idea that answers why daddy, we start to go a little more off the rails. But before we do that, and I said we wouldn't talk about him, but I do want to briefly acknowledge that the prevalence of fatherhood has to be somehow, consciously or unconsciously, bound up in these broader movements among men, among incels and Gamergate, among the questioning and reconstruction of masculinity that seemingly happens every decade or so. Games are media, influenced by the broader media and political landscape. And with this decade on the heels of Tony Soprano, it bore witness to Walter White, and it saw countless other popular dad figures across other mediums. The 2010s saw people killed in incel-related attacks. We men that seem to fall into these ESA gamer age brackets have become increasingly manipulated and coerced by algorithms to buy male-related products or think certain ways about what it means to be a man. I want to suggest that there's something more going on that I believe has, at least somehow in part, influenced the dominance of dads in the idea of fatherhood in video games. It's not a causal, maybe it's correlated. Maybe it's just a very strange coincidence that I think that this can help explain why fatherhood is everywhere in an industry where things are predominantly made by men and predominantly consumed by men. Anyways, back to the final idea of why daddy. Popular game critic and feminist Anita Sarkeesian produced an essay series discussing the role of female characters in video games. She examines the long history of female objectification, exploitation, and subjugation in video games. She talks about how, over time, female characters have gone from something you need to rescue at the end of the game to something that is killed off that requires you to go seek revenge for, to something that you might need to continually help, like a femme fatale or sidekick. Note the use of thing here. Indeed, female characters have been objects more than characters. I encourage you to go watch these videos yourself. Links in the description below. So now I would suggest that this damsel in distress trope has a new form. That of a father protecting their daughter or daughter-esque character. 8 years ago, username The Anthrope wrote on a Reddit thread, "Why are father-daughter dynamics so popular compared to all other parent-child variations?" I think it's an evolution of the save the princess trope. Now the princess is by your side as you save her, as in The Last of Us. Plus, you get to play some chapters as an ass-kicking young girl, which is fun for everyone. Note that this doesn't extend to all of why daddy. Kratos and Atreus fall out of this, for example. However, there is still the idea of protecting a smaller, more innocent character. So intrinsically, the prevalence of fatherhood is not something outside of the histories of video games. It's not some phenomena. Rather, like the evolving emotional male hero, the dominance of daddy is a progression of the damsel in distress trope, in a weird, problematic relationship with female characters in video games. When seeing daddy as the next step of damsel, it makes sense as to why it's everywhere in the decade of the dad, because the damseling of women was historically everywhere. So, to summarize, my fellow adventurers, of why I think there is so much fatherhood in this decade of roughly from 2010 to 2020 is for the reasons that we talked about. Here's your pop quiz. Game developers are getting older and becoming parents and turning to parenthood as a source for their creative vision. Gamers are getting older, becoming parents themselves, and likely resonating more with games that are representative of their current worldview. We're getting an evolution of the male protagonist as the industry matures and becomes more sophisticated. Fatherhood has become a narrative shortcut for connecting with players because of the aforementioned, and father-child relationships, especially father-daughter, can be seen as an organic evolution of the problematic damsel in distress tropes. At this point, you're asking, so John, is this bad? Well,
my father took me into the city to see
By this point, you might be able to deduce yes and no. But we also can't answer this question without talking about where are all the moms. This part and part 3 are entangled with one another. And like anything in life, the dominance of daddy is both problematic and not. Some days I wake up thinking how thoughtful and nuanced the relationship is between Kratos and Atreus. Other days I wake up deeply annoyed about God of War 2018, or can't make a story about fatherhood without a dead mom. So the answer to our question is inevitably going to be both, neither, and somewhere in the middle. We're going to start with a narrower view of this and discussing the works of Professor Sarah Stang's Big Daddies and Broken Men, Father-Daughter Relationships in Video Games, and Caitlin Claflin's Playing Dad, an analysis of video game fathers and their daughters as playable characters. Both of these scholars are Canadian, and funnily enough, Sarkeesian is too, so I feel particularly compelled to start here. Stang and Claflin's analyses largely share from the same menu of daddy games: The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, Dishonored and Dishonored 2, and BioShock 2. These games are my Totilo's trio. Stang and Claflin assert a similar idea as that Kotaku article. These games are centrally about a paternalistic, violent, and controlling version of fatherhood, and use female characters, the daughter, as a way for paternal redemption. Stang states, this dadification of video games is simply another way in which male characters are given control over female characters. Claflin writes, although daughters are important secondary protagonists within their games, their development, individuality, and well-being are set aside in favor of focusing on their reaction to their father's actions and their father's eventual redemption. As a consequence of these often complicated and contradictory approaches to the daughter's development as secondary protagonists, they inhabit a gray area with numerous positive and negative aspects. One interesting observation I found from Claflin's writing was about how daughters are physically designed and represented. They are often petite, with wide eyes. Their innocence and need for protection is played up. Daughters are never seemingly portrayed as powerful, and even though Elizabeth is formidable as a daughter, she's still small and in need of protection. This petiteness is not just found in daughters either. Atreus has the same physical representation. Look at those big eyes. But you might be thinking about Ciri from The Witcher, a popular daughter character who neither needs protection or is small and childlike. And you're right. Ciri's representation and commentary on fatherhood is a stark contrast compared to Clementine and Ellie. I think this too illustrates my problem with Stang and Claflin in a lot of academic literature and a lot of critique. They often talk about the same few games and ignore the ubiquity of fatherhood. Funnily enough, a broader net can work for these academic positions too, even though I also think there are powerful and positive examples of fatherhood in video games during this decade of the dad, and that seeing them represented does do wonders for the medium. Geralt, to me, in his relationship with Ciri, which Just Right also notes, is a really positive depiction of fatherhood that isn't centered around violence or protection, but actually about how to be a supportive parent. But if you were to take Stang, Claflin's, and Sarkeesian's position, you would say undeniably, yeah, the dominance of dads is problematic. But part of me also thinks that they don't actually go far enough, because The Last of Us Part 2 addresses some of their criticism. When we play as Ellie and Abby in the sequel, we were playing fundamentally as competent female heroines who escaped the father-daughter bondage. Part 2 was released in 2020. It has to be the capstone, marquee event to shake up this trend, to end the decade of the dad definitively. Except, it doesn't. There's this video, 4 journalists vs. The Last of Us Part 2, that fundamentally, at the core, upsets me in some way, because I don't think I like it's emblematic of how games media like to talk about games, and I don't like it. I think there's a lot of problems with it, but more on that some other time. But at the same time, there's this line from Jess Joho that I can't stop thinking about.
And I just find this game to be pretending to be about daughters and actually being really insulting, because it's not. It's about their dads defining.
That's why the dominance of the video game dad is a problem. Because when we try to build up a different story, a different experience, we can't escape the daddy. We can't become more sophisticated in our storytelling. It's a sign, maybe, that we can't make better or different video games. That's a problem. On the flip side of this is to be ruthlessly pragmatic. Games are expensive to make. Games need to sell. We aren't talking about art for media and philosophy and society's sake. This is a business. This is an industry. And remember how I said that the majority of gamers are still dudes and now they average in their 30s? There's this idea that the importance of representation of the player character varies. But notably, it does matter. That PlayStation executive said 60% of PlayStation ownership was male. So why not make games that appeal to a male majority audience? Why not make a game about dads? Stories about fatherhood clearly work in the early 2010s. The mega hits of Red Dead Redemption, Dishonored, BioShock, The Walking Dead, The Last of Us all show us a clear path to financial returns. The Witcher 3 in 2015 arguably put a whole country on the game dev map. These games are the product of small, moderate gradualism of evolving an entrenched history of the male hero, the damsel. They move the needle enough to be noticeable, but not radical enough to be upsetting. More importantly, they have won countless awards, received mountains of praise, and have been profitable. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed shows all sides of this question, but most interestingly, the inside look of how the industry needs, or believes it needs, masculinity and arguably fatherhood to sell video games. There's a whole slew of controversies around gender with this studio dating back to 2014, but what I find most interesting is that Assassin's Creed Origins, where you play as a father, Bayek, was meant to have you play as Aya, Bayek's wife and a mother. In Odyssey, there was only supposed to be Cassandra, who is the daughter, the sister. In each of these instances, developers say Ubisoft's marketing department inserted itself and said games with female protagonists wouldn't sell. There needs to be an option to play as a man. Notably, the Bloomberg article that reports on this shows how this marketing idea fails to appreciate the series of Tomb Raider and the Horizon Zero Dawn games, but funnily enough, those games have a subtler version of masculinity and daddy in them. And perhaps we need to realize games with female protagonists are exceptions to the norm. Overall, as much as I wish Origins could have just been about Aya, and Odyssey just about Cassandra, the ruthless, pragmatic part of me understands the reasoning. Is the prevalence of daddy bad? No, because it's representative of the audience that consumes the thing you're making. But most days, when I think about this dominance of daddy and the weeks that it has taken to make this video, and if it's all a problem or problematic, I just come to the conclusion that the whole reason why I wrestle with it is because its everywhereness is a detriment to the problem of the prevalence of daddy is tied inextricably with the invisibility of motherhood. Why are there no moms? Well, we actually kinda already answered it. There are hardly any creative directors of video games who are moms, so we get dads writing about being a dad. Most gamers are still dudes and now getting old, becoming dads. And so naturally, thirdly, this is a male-dominated space with male-dominated stories, and I guess that means we don't have time for motherhood. There's a great video by Cannot Be Tamed, Where Are All the Moms, that explores this in greater detail and really just discusses how many dead moms there are across the history of video games. What hurts more, though, when talking about motherhood is that some of the big games we've discussed throughout this video have some pretty harrowing depictions of motherhood, as well as being all about daddy. The Last of Us Part 2's subliminal or obvious ideas of motherhood are deeply problematic and patriarchal for those moms who aren't killed off anyways. Freya in God of War 2018 frustrates me to no end. And just a sidebar, I really like God of War, the Leviathan axe. Oh, so good. I like this game, but it frustrates me. And Freya frustrates me to no end. And I always thought her lack of autonomy in the game, her submissiveness to Kratos, and the final scene with her own son makes her inclusion on Sony's International Women's Day PlayStation marketing incredibly rich. In Dishonored, mom's dead. In BioShock Infinite, dead at childbirth. In The Walking Dead, does it even matter at this point? This makes the Assassin's Creed franchise ever the more frustrating, as Ubisoft as a company is seemingly inept at creating safe spaces for women, because Marine and Aya stand out on the podium as some positive examples of motherhood in this decade of the dad. We even get to play as one briefly in the form of Aya. You can have a game studio seemingly be accused of misogyny, but also produce some of the decade's best moms in video games. Two things can be true at once, I suppose. And Yennefer in The Witcher 3 stands out as another positive maternal figure. I'd argue she's the best female NPC of the decade, but that's another video for another time. Some indie games have also shown us good glimpses of mom, like in Celeste, Short Hike, and Gris. I'm especially excited for the developers of Gris's next game, Neva, which seems to address the themes of motherhood head on. Let's go, and there's a wolf. I do realize though that this is going to be self-referential, because the shortest part of this video is discussing about motherhood. There's irony in that. But fundamentally, there isn't a whole lot to say. Stang's final line in her 2017 article summarizes it all really well. While paternal narratives are emotionally compelling, for the industry to truly demonstrate its maturation, developers need to begin featuring healthier, more compassionate father-daughter bonds, more daughters as player characters, and perhaps more importantly, more maternal protagonists. Everyone agrees. Nakey Jakey, Just Right, Stang, Claflin, Sarkeesian, Cannot Be Tamed, these 5 journalists, and I bet all your gaming buddies, is that we need more moms. We don't even really know what games of motherhood can actually be about because we've had so few. But in researching for this video, I found out that the hero in Beyond Good and Evil is a mom to orphans, and Bayonetta is a kind of a kick-ass mom, so I really need to play those games. But ultimately, whether or not you decide the decade of the dad is problematic kind of depends on where you stand on all of these ideas. You're allowed to be on the spectrum, ever shifting. I know I am. I honestly oscillate between it all being deeply problematic to being utterly pragmatic about it, and it all depends what side of the bed I woke up on. But what I do recognize now, what is my truth in all of this, is that in all of my researching and writing and thinking and scripting and whatever voice talking and gaming and chatting with friends about this, is that I think daddy is just kind of starting to get old. It really is everywhere. So it's now a bit boring, a bit predictable. It's a tired trope, at least in its current form, which means before we reach the end of our quest, I want to leave you with some questions and observations to think about what could come next in the post-daddy world of video games, and even if there can be a post-daddy. I really don't think we have good public data on who exactly plays and buys games. That's the conclusion I sort of reached in researching for this video, but I do think we can piece together enough anecdotes and data points to suggest that there are more older gamers than we've had before. So does that mean more gamers are going to be over the age of 50? Will that average age keep going up? Will we get daddies like Druckmann and Barlog and more now reflecting on other more mature ideas to ground the writing for their games? Like, are we gonna get old? Or will all of this reverse somehow and games reject perhaps notions of fatherhood for more youthful ideas of rebellion and individuality? Honestly, give me a little bit of a hero with midlife existential nihilism. But also, if all of our daddy gamers and daddy game devs had this period in this decade of the dad, their kids are going to get older now too. So what games are they going to show their kids? Are they going to make games for their kids? Are we going to be wanting more family-friendly versions of our favorite franchises? And how long will it take to see the rise of moms? If we keep seeing female protagonists, rising female gamer audiences, and likely rising female representation in game studios, that must mean we're going to get more or any creative directors that are women and moms of some big AAA movie games, right? I bet by this time next decade, I'll get to tell you about all the awesome mommy games that have come out. I hope. Or maybe some proper games about playing as a female hero without it all being about the dad. I'll be deeply curious about how Ghost of Yote shapes up, and I think it will be a key signpost for the 2020s. Will it escape Jin's shadow of being a daddy game? And also, many of the really big games so far of the 2020s, and I haven't played Ragnarok and Forbidden West yet, I know, I'm sorry, but games like Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, and Baldur's Gate 3 aren't really about families, but do have things to say about gender and identity. How could this evolve for the rest of the decade? I think it should be clear, though, that daddy and the themes of masculinity and what it is to be a man and so on isn't going away, save maybe how prevalent it is in all corners of gaming. We're coming off this glorious decade of daddy games, and while I'll still think we'll have to see if the dust has truly settled, I bet you all, the next Naughty Dog game will be unable to escape the power and dominance of daddy. So now that we've reached the end of this road, I want to say that games are awesome, and we can love games and critique games at the same time. This is meant to be my meandering, disentangling of themes and forces in our game narratives, and how our stories and experiences situate themselves in a broader context of the history of games and also societal norms. Here's our string conspiracy board trying to lay this all out. I hope I've circled back on everything I said I would, and I hope you found this a little bit informative. I can safely say that 2010s was the decade of the video game dad, and as we've illustrated, it has so many reasons as to why it seemed to happen that way, and there's a variety of positions you can take about how much of a problem that really is. Me, personally, I just hope we'll see these three things going forward. More games that prove Totilo wrong, that games can express ideas of parenthood without always needing to be violent. More games that stop killing off the moms so we can start including them in our stories. And perhaps moving past this altogether and having more games that just leave the family to the decade of the dad. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you found this video at least a little bit insightful. Please leave a comment below about whether or not you agree or disagree. What are some of your favorite daddy games or mommy games? As always, my hope is to not necessarily prove to you something, but to get you walking away from this thinking about games a little bit differently. And two quick things. One, if you're a subscriber to Quest Marker, don't forget to hit that bell. Sounds terrible to say, but I think YouTube allegedly changed its algorithm a few months back, and one of the key sort of success markers to pushing out videos to wider audiences is if subscribers engage with the content. So if you don't, I think that makes my life more difficult or something. And two, I had a couple comments in a world talking about what sort of community features that Quest Marker has, and I just kind of decided to create a subreddit. It's going to appear somewhere on screen, so maybe we can have some conversations there. It's the Wild Wild West right there. There's no rules or anything, so I'm just going to see how it goes. And as always,